Let me first welcome our listeners to this International Dialogue Initiative podcast on the war in Gaza, local and regional perspectives. I'm Jerry Fromm. I'm the past president of the International Dialogue Initiative, and I'm very happy that two of my colleagues in the IDI have agreed to join us today for a conversation. Before I introduce Hiba and Nimrod, let me just say that the International Dialogue Initiative was founded in 2007 by Vamek Volkan, Professor Vamek Volkan, whose ideas have been very influential for us and for many other people. We are a small group of about 20 or so professionals from different disciplines and different countries who get together regularly to discuss the psychology of societal conflict and to consider various interventions. We have a website, and I hope some of our listeners visit it and learn more about the IDI. For today, we're going to have a conversation about Israel, Gaza, Palestine, and events on the ground since the October 7th horrific invasion by Hamas and Israel's massive response to that. It seems like the world has turned upside down, that something really of a different order of magnitude is happening in the Middle East, and I'm very interested in hearing the perspectives of Hiba and Nimrod about that. Let me introduce our two IDI colleagues. Hiba Husseini is managing partner of the law firm Husseini and Husseini. She's been the chair of the legal committee for the final status negotiations between Palestine and Israel for some time. And Hiba is a legal advisor to the peace process in many different parts of that system since 1994. She's been a member of many local, regional, and international working groups, continues that work, and serves on the board of many organizations and committees, and lectures quite widely. Nimrod Goren is Senior Fellow for Israeli Affairs at the Middle East Institute. He was the founder and past president of MITVIM, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policy, and now, most recently, Nimrod has co-founded Diplomeds, the Council for Mediterranean Diplomacy. Nimrod is also very widely involved, including in the Israeli Climate Forum. Nimrod has a PhD in Middle Eastern Studies from Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and I really can't think of two more well-versed people on what's going on in the Middle East than the two of you. So let me just start off by asking how you are, given what's happening on the ground these days, and what's happening to those around you, and how are things? Either one, Hiba or Nimrod, whoever would like to start with that.
See, we're hesitating, which tells you that we are thinking about about the situation. We're also very differential to each other, which is very unique these days. But here I am. I have started. Nimrod, with permission, I will start. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you for this opportunity. I think it's very, very important that we are having this discussion on what's going on, because not only has it affected each one of us personally, each in our own different ways, and I will say a word about that before we get into the larger issue in response to your question. I am personally doing well, terribly exhausted and tired. The stress level is very high. I can honestly say that I have not experienced this kind of stress and as a result of what's going on, and that the feeling of that deep feeling of pain and suffering and the wounds that are festering. I'm usually a very optimistic person with high energy, one cannot live in isolation of what's going on around on a day-to-day basis, especially since the situation, this war has been prolonged. I mean, it's 6 months. We're into month six right now. And of course, I move between Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, where I reside, and the West Bank to Ramallah, where my office is. So I have to go through checkpoints, I tell you, the situation at checkpoints is very difficult these days, and movement is very difficult. So overall, I can't say that Jerusalem is a war zone. But we feel every bit of the intensity of what's going on down south. And I hope that this will come to an end very, very soon. We really have to work very hard for this ceasefire and to continue the next day and the day after.
Nimrod, how about you?
Yeah, thank you, Jerry, and thank you, Hiba. I think the most important thing for me during this point of time is to really engage as much as possible in constructive dialogue with neighbors, with colleagues from the region. I think we live in such a polarized period of months, and rightly so for many. Like Hiba mentioned, what happened on October 7th and afterwards touches each and every one of us in terms of our personal surroundings. The losses around us are immense, each one in different circles and in different proximity. But in the Israeli society, everybody is impacted. Some have been impacted on October 7th and are still processing. And for some, it's still ongoing, whether it's the hostages, whether it's people who are serving in the military, whether there are people that may be called for reserves, whether there are people who are evacuated from their homes. And we know, I know, and everybody around us knows people from each of these categories. So it's very personal, and it's very taking an inward looking approach for many within the society. So within such a situation, to keep the determination for peace, for engagement, for dialogue, despite all the hardships involved, and find partners on different sides that are willing to do that, I think this is something that is very much respected and
Yeah,
looking for.
yeah. I was speaking yesterday with a group of group analysts in Israel, sponsored by Robbie Friedman, our colleague in IDI, and they were so grateful for outside contact and for a conversation. It's very much what you're saying about the isolation and the sense of threat and how personal it all is. So it was very, very interesting to hear their comments. What do you see on the horizon in the near term in terms of this conflict? Do you see anything that's hopeful, or is there something you're terribly afraid is going to happen in the near term?
So I can take this one first, Hiba, perhaps. It's very difficult to predict. This whole episode began with a day that nobody could foresee coming. So when we look into the future, there is the ability to predict and develop scenarios. And sometimes it's quite an easy approach taken by multiple actors of spelling out the different possible futures that can come out of this situation. But we also need to identify what is the desired future that we hope for and aspire for, and try to steer things in that direction. So in terms of what I would like to see, first I think in Israel there is an overall support in the broad war objectives as defined by the military and political leadership in terms of bringing the hostages back home and making sure that Hamas will not be the one governing Gaza or posing additional military threats on Israel. So that's something Israelis support, even when they do not support the prime minister or the way things are being managed. So I think part of the hope that I have is to see a leadership in Israel that can not only bring those objectives to life, but do so in a manner that does not cause too much damage, but also that paves the way for a better future, a peaceful future, because the current thing that we are witnessing is the leadership that we have at home that is not geared towards the kind of future that those within the Israeli center left pro-peace camp is yearning for. So I hope, for early elections to be called in Israel. I hope for domestic political transitions, both in Israel and the Palestinian Authority. I hope for less incitement and divisive language within our society. And I hope for a way to chart a path towards a two-state solution and regional integration of Israel within the region and the international community.
Yeah. I think I agree with Nimrod in terms of one cannot really predict the exact scenario that will unfold, but many of us, and I'm sure Nimrod has been as well. We've been engaged with various international and regional interlocutors and local interlocutors in terms of looking at scenarios and looking at plans and devising proposals that could work. And of course, many of them could, but I think the most important thing is to take stock and start from the day where we cannot go back to pre-October 7th. I mean, October 7th has been a game changer for both societies and for the two people living in Israel, Palestine. And I think it has come to our realization, notwithstanding the emotional impact it's had on us, that the way forward has to be an end to this conflict. And from a Palestinian perspective, looking into the near to longer term, we have been seeking statehood and independence from occupation and seeking self-determination since 1967. And we have not been able to realize that. Of course, there are a lot of complicated reasons as to why and why not. But bottom line, our neighbor Israel enjoys statehood and sovereignty, and we don't. And the imbalance in the relationship has continued this conflict to rage into cycles of violence. We remember 1987, First Intifada, and then peace process started. Oslo process was launched. We were all very optimistic. Then you have a setback at a second Intifada in 2000, and a spiral of events where Hamas takes control of the Gaza Strip, and the whole notion of the peace process that we built and worked so hard for in the 1990s, fell apart, and the whole and collapsed basically. And now we are living the consequences of that. So we have to realize that, notwithstanding what the leaders want, we are implicating not only ourselves but the entire region and the globe in this conflict. And conflict management for years has not worked. It's been cosmetic, fixing one part or one situation after the other, escalation, de-escalation of violence. So I think what again October 7th brought to bear is that we must find an end to this conflict, and we must reconcile, and we must create an environment of peace for both of us, for as two nations, and for security and stability of ourselves and the region.
Yeah. I'm sure you both saw that yesterday, Senator Chuck Schumer, who's the Democratic majority leader in the Senate, and really the top Jewish politician in the United States, called for the end of the Netanyahu government and a commitment to a two-state solution. It was, to my mind at least, a remarkable declaration from the number one Jewish politician in the U.S. And I think it was aimed toward at least two goals. One was to make clear that being against the Netanyahu government is not being anti-Israel or anti-Semitic, to make that distinction very clearly, and also to convey that the idea of a two-state solution isn't necessarily an ideal, but it's a very practical, very practical. There is no other solution from his point of view. What do you think about that? Does that make sense to the two of you?
Yeah, it was a very surprising thing to hear when you take into account the history of Israel-US relations and of Chuck
Yeah.
Schumer himself, given his position and the way he even cooperated with Netanyahu on key issues like the Iran did in the past. So it is a meaningful thing for an Israeli audience. Perhaps it's a bit more sophisticated to understand who Chuck Schumer is and what's the impact of his wording, but I guess this same language that he used will slowly find its way into more, upper circles within the administration in the coming months. So it's very clear that the message coming from Washington to Israel is we are going after Netanyahu with that. So we support Israel, we support the war objectives. The US was so supportive of Israel on October 7th and later, and the messages conveyed by President Biden on a personal level to the Israeli public very much resonated. It gave Israel the thing that we needed and we didn't get from our current leadership. So the Israeli public that is already yearning for this leadership change, and you see it since October, about 70 to 80% of the Israeli public from left and right and center say they lost faith in the prime minister and they want a new leader. It does not mean that they necessarily move to the two-state solution. And I think that's a distinction that is very clear when you look at it from Israel, but sometimes less clear looking from afar, that there is a gap between the leadership change and the sense of urgency around that, and whether the Israeli public is ready now for progress toward the two-state solution. I think the INSS, the National Security Think Tank in Israel, just published a poll with the lowest ever support within Israel of a two-state solution, about 35% of the Jewish population, which is really low. It doesn't mean that you cannot get there, but it means that you need to prioritize first to change the coalition, to have a more moderate, more reasonable, a different kind of coalition, more like the Bennett and Lapid previous coalition that was very wide and diverse in terms of ideology. And when we have such a government in place, then we can gradually rebuild trust in the solution itself, in our Palestinian neighbors, and in a process that may lead to that. So it's a long way away that often is not converging with political timelines in the US, in Europe, in other places. And that's a challenge for our camp here in Israel to bridge that gap of timeline, at least.
Yeah. And when you cite those figures, Nimrod, that only 35% of the population is interested in the two-state solution now, what do you think the other 65% are thinking? Is it that, do they have a position, or is it more that we have to manage the conflict first of all, and then we can talk about something else?
I think there are a lot of question marks within the Israeli society at the moment, which is a good thing because many people were very fixed in terms of how they saw the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, now reassess their positions. Now, the issue is that many of them do not know where they are moving with this reassessment to. And the Israeli left and center left and pro-peace camp does not have a strong enough political representation and leadership within the parliament now to actually mobilize people into the good direction. So it's not that the 35% I think will stick. I think it will change back and it will be somewhere back in the middle. But you need to have someone leading the way, and the political level echelons are not doing that. So civil society is stepping into that. And just today, there was a big plan coming out of the Mitvim Institute and the Berl Katzenelson Center, two of the most important center-left organizations in Israel, charting a new policy plan in terms of security and diplomacy on the Palestinian issue to do actually what leaders should do, spell out the vision, show the way that could be taken. This is a conversation that we need to have more in Israel. And then more of the people will come back to seeing the solution, maybe the most desired one, but whether they believe it could actually be attained, That's still a long way away. That was the situation before October 7. It's much more significant now, mostly around
Yeah.
security concerns. Can Israel really take security moves that will change its realities in a way that it perceived to do before October 7, in a new reality that is
Yeah.
happening
Yeah.
afterwards?
Hiba, how do you hear Charles Schumer's statement?
Well, I think that certainly was a surprise and certainly a positive turn. I think the U.S. has been supporting, as Nimrod said, Israel unequivocally. But now they realize that Prime Minister Netanyahu is heading into to really, if I may call it, quicksand and dragging the region and even the U.S. And the credibility of the U.S. along the way. I think also we cannot undermine the fact that in the US there have been massive public demonstrations to stop the war, and the same is happening across the globe. So I think popular public support to end for a ceasefire and to end this war, I think, has also played a factor. I think there's a realization, perhaps, that the US has to really tell Netanyahu that you are not working at this moment in time in the interest of Israel. The interest of Israel is to live in security and have the right to self-defense, but not to a point where it cannot does not know when to stop, because the region is implicated, because you have the Houthis, the Hezbollah, and the Shia in Iraq, and I mean, and the threats are growing, and so there's the entire region is facing is experiencing instability, and the longer term, the more time it drags, this war, the more instability and insecurity there will be, and it'll be difficult to justify and maintain the support for Israel and for its own interests. I think also there's a lot of discussion among the Arab states in the region for a way forward, and Netanyahu with an extreme right government. And I think this is why the study that the INS published with this poll in terms of the 35%, I think it reflects the current mood in Israel, in terms of Israel having moved to the right and the extreme right over the last few years. So I think it's very difficult for the Israeli public to even consider having a two-state solution at the present time, when the mood in Israel feels that they're threatened, they feel insecure, and I think it's not in their mind. It is not time to speak about a two-state solution. So I think that's why a statement by Schumacher is very, very important for the Israeli public to hear, and of course for Netanyahu
Yeah.
and his team.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's stay with the wider region for a second. You may have seen an article by the New York Times writer Thomas Friedman. He's written a lot since October 7th, but before October 7th, he wrote an article, and the article talked about a trip that some of the senior Israeli politicians on the right made to Riyadh, and there was a photograph of they were in a hotel room with the skyline of Riyadh outside, so it was clearly Saudi Arabia. And they were conducting a religious service in the hotel room. And there was a photograph taken of that, the service and the skyline of Riyadh. And Friedman's article said that this was meant to be an enormous provocation by the government to say, in a sense, look at what we have accomplished. We are about to have a new and much better relation with Saudi Arabia. Look at what we've accomplished without having to give up anything. And he argued that the photograph was a provocation to the Palestinians. And not long after that, the attack occurred. And so, part of the reason for the attack, he argued, was to, in a sense, destabilize the beginning agreements, the Abraham Accords, and the agreements that were moving in the direction of a new relationship with Saudi Arabia. What do you think? Both of you are regional specialists here.
I do not know how to assess the motivation of Hamas. I can guess, I can assess, but I will not go. I think there. I will go into the dimension of the provocation that you mentioned and what it means in terms of Israel's regional relations, because I don't think it's a provocation. I think this picture exactly showcases both the religious aspect of religious tolerance that Gulf states are now trying to project, utilizing Judaism as an entry point to better relations between the Arab world and Israel. And it's not by chance that the Saudis are using that, because the first steps of the Saudi opening towards Israel, which by the way is already happening for a decade. I think it was 2014 when this strategic decision to gradually open up towards Israel was made, and since then it began through religious Jewish related aspects, visits to synagogues in the States, statements by religious leaders, interreligious dialogue. Then it went on to the more kind of national politics space of Israel rather than Jewish. The Abraham Accords in the UAE, one of the most significant things that they emphasize is their religious tolerance. And they have this new compound with a mosque and a church and synagogue all together. So playing the religious card to reflect openness and moderation, I think is a thing that the Gulf states have been doing. Going beyond that, zooming out a bit, it reflects a deep change that Israel's positioning within the Middle East underwent during the last decade or even several years. We are celebrating 45 years of peace with Egypt this month. We are celebrating 30 years of peace with Jordan later this year. Those were real pillars of Israel's shifting realities within the region. Those peace treaties happened without a Palestinian state established, with some progress, after the Oslo Accord, Jordan pitched in, but with Egypt, that was not the case as well. So the linkage that needs to be done between the Palestinian issue and the Israeli-Arab normalization is not trivial. You need to make the case for that. The UAE and Bahrain, when they did the Abraham Accords, they linked it on preventing Netanyahu from annexing territories in the West Bank. Now, there are doubts whether Netanyahu intended to do it anyway, or was it kind of a face-saving card that he played. But definitely now the Saudis, when they are planning for a possible normalization with Israel, which I think they still want, in the context of a defense pact with the US, maybe even without it, they need to showcase some achievements, some progress on the Palestinian issue. But their demands on that have been dwindling down. 20 years ago, the Arab Peace Initiative very clearly spells the sequence. First, the establishment of a Palestinian state, then Israeli-Arab normalization. The more recent statements coming from Riyadh are about requirements that are falling much less than that. Pathways to a Palestinian state, irreversible steps for a state. Now it's about recognition of Security Council members. So all kind of much softer conditions that will still show progress on the Palestinian side, but will be far away from what I think the Palestinians actually want and need. But Hiba knows better than me on that.
Hiba?
Yeah, I think along the same lines, I would say I don't think performing an act of religious worship is in itself a provocation. Uh, I think the issue is far larger and deeper than that. I think the fact that it was in Saudi Arabia and the fact that it was seen as potentially a symbol of the upcoming normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, where the Palestinian issue was on the back burner. and that Saudi Arabia was following in the footsteps of the Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco, and Sudan for that matter, and the normalization that was unfolding to the isolation of the Palestinian issue and the Palestinian cause, among many other reasons. I mean, the fact that, according to Hamas's declared objectives, they have been living in a prison for nearly 17 years. They cannot, the people of Gaza, around 2.3 million people living in very difficult conditions. Poverty, lack of economic opportunity, lack of movement. It's a virtual prison in a very small area. So, and the fact that there is the Palestinian national disunity or lack of unity between Ramallah and Gaza. The West Bank and Gaza are isolated, and Hamas and Fatah don't see eye to eye. So many, and the fact that the settlement activity was ongoing, and here is you have normalization happening, settlement activity in the West Bank, going full speed. Also the provocation, the more provocation other than the photo, other than this photo, was issues related to Jerusalem, really, and Al-Aqsa Mosque, Temple Mount, and the declaration by this extreme government, especially Ben Gvir, that the prayer rights, that the Jewish rights to pray in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Temple Mount. I think many factors played into what happened. The photo probably was just a symbol of the underlying political instability here. So while Saudi was pursuing its interests and Israel was pursuing its interests with U.S. support, here we are, the Palestinians lagging behind and living continue to live under occupation without any form of political horizon for this conflict to be resolved.
Yeah.
So I think that's what probably played more into this photo.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you both about the settler movement. What we read over here is that, as you say, Hiba, it's going full speed. And that, in a sense, one of the unspoken interests in keeping the war going on the Israeli side is not only the corruption charges against Netanyahu, but the way in which the war is, in a certain sense, a distraction from a kind of de facto annexation happening in the settler movement in the West Bank. Is that accurate at all? Is the settler movement going full speed, and is there any governmental position about that that you know of?
I think it happened much before October 7. Okay, the settlement expansion continued under multiple governments. I think the settlement lobby and organization had a very clear agenda at times when governments were kind of not really clear on where they want to see things. You saw it also happening when left-wing leaders were in power. It's not as if settlement activities stopped even during the days of Barak and Rabin and Peres, and there is criticism in retrospect about how they handled those issues. I think the worrying thing that is happening in the last year is since the coming to power of the real far-right coalition that Netanyahu leads. So I don't think it's a way to prolong the war. I don't buy into this narrative, but definitely since this coalition came to power, it gives back wind to all those extremist elements within the settler movement that feel that they now are empowered by their leaders within the Knesset and the government, because you have political actors, and Hiba mentioned Ben Gvir and people like Smotrich, who are totally marginalized within the Israeli mainstream discourse and are now penetrated that and actually got positions that are so significant. not significant in terms of making the decision on what will happen with the war, but in terms of deciding what the police does or where the money goes, and what kind of backing they can give to their extremists on the ground, engaged even in settler violence. So this is giving those actors, I think, more space to work on. And for that, I think it's very encouraging that some of the international actors and Israel's strongest allies are beginning to go after that. And we hear about the sanctions on specific settlers who are involved in violent acts against Palestinian citizens. So there is an understanding that, even if there are ideological risks within the Israeli government, etc., there are some things that you cannot accept. And the need for political change is also to bring the moderates, even on the right, to be more significant compared to those on the far right that, by the way, are not only causing damage within the West Bank. If you look at what's happening in the weekly protests in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem in terms of police violence against Israelis demonstrating for hostage release or for peace or against Netanyahu, this is really being stepped up, guided by Minister Ben-Gvir himself.
Yeah.
Hiba?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think they are so encouraged. The extreme right and the right in Israel has grown so powerful. They're dictating policies, and they're affecting the scene in Israel, in Israeli internal politics, but also, of course, to a larger extent vis-a-vis the Palestinians. I mean, the not only annexation, not only their desire is to annex the West Bank, but to not to concede any, I mean, to prevent the two-state solution from happening. This is the declared policy. So they have been working to weaken the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. And this was part of the Netanyahu strategy. Turn a blind eye to Hamas in Gaza with its control of the Gaza Strip, receiving money from Qatar, and it seems to be living in some sort of a truce between Israel and Hamas. While the West Bank, there are incursions happening by the Israeli army on a daily basis in the West Bank. No building permits are granted for Area C. At the same time, the land is being slowly annexed, limiting the space that is available for the Palestinians for the growth and development and the infrastructure development in Area C and around Jerusalem in favor of the settlers is huge and has been ongoing indeed for the last 15, 20 years.
Yeah. What do you think would happen? I mean, if Chuck Schumer's, advice to Israel were carried out, and it led to a new government that declared itself committed to a two-state solution, it seems to be one of the first things that government would have to do would be to address the settler movement. And what do you think would happen if it did?
I think the political scenario, the more likely one, is a different one, in which, if Israel goes to election, and talking about like the good scenario for people within our ideology, is not a government, unfortunately, that will put a two-state solution on top of its agenda, but it will be a government that will not block it actively.
Would not block it the way Netanyahu does.
Will not block it proactively. So it will not take steps to prevent. And currently the Israeli public is on the ideological side tilting more to the right, becoming more hawkish, losing faith in the two-state solution, in the Palestinian partners. But in terms of electoral behavior, at least for now, according to the polls, it moves to the center. It's the centrist party led by former Chief of Staff Benny Gantz that is skyrocketing in the polls. Now, there's a question whether that will stay until election day, but it shows the paradox of the society, that you want to have a responsible, moderate, security-minded leader who cares about the national good, not his own personal interest. But in terms of the ideas, the population goes elsewhere. So you may have a coalition eventually that will be merging these two trends into one, and that will not be a clear pro-peace coalition. On the downside, the upside of that is that we had such a model previously with the Bennett and Lapid government. And what happened is that so many people, like in our conversation, like in other many international conversation, the focus is on Netanyahu. It becomes very personalized. And for many countries in the region also, sometimes intentionally they do that, they focus on Netanyahu. So when Netanyahu is gone, even if the ones replacing him will not be very different in terms of their ideology, they will be seen as much more legitimate to engage with. When Naftali Bennett, who is coming from the core of the settlement movement, became the prime minister, he was quite immediately welcomed very warmly within Arab capitals, and he managed to launch cooperation with Palestinian ministries and welcomed in Europe. So just the change will by itself catalyze some positive progress, even though the two-state solution I don't think will be on the top agenda of that coalition. It will contain the radicals, it will sideline them again, hopefully that will be the scenario, but in the immediate term I don't think it will do much more than that.
Hiba?
Well, I mean, Israel would have to change not only a leader or a prime minister, but also a systematic policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians and vis-a-vis the two-state solution. Unless that happens, I'm afraid that it will not be a priority indeed. But there the regional Arab states and the international community led by the US and the EU have to probably create the environment for the two-state solution to slowly start the discussion. Because if we let this, we drop it immediately after after Prime Minister Netanyahu leaves office and is replaced by another coalition government in Israel with a new prime minister, and this and there's a ceasefire and the war ends, and we need to deal with Gaza. We need to deal with the reconstruction and the humanitarian crisis. We need to deal with a freeze on settlement activity. If we can get at least step by step actions to lead to the to sow the seed again for negotiations. I mean, I think many of us who observe and are involved, I mean, realize that it's not going to happen in the next day, but we need to pave the way for it, and not let it become sit on the back burner again, because if that happens, I don't see any security and stability locally.
Yeah. You know, as we were preparing for this conversation in our emails back and forth, we talked about recognizing the degree of trauma in the Israeli and Palestinian society. I suppose, given what's happening right now, it's hard to. It's just a matter of survival for so many people in Gaza. But it seems to me that one reading of the barbarity of Hamas' attack on Israel was that it was meant to inflict maximal trauma to all of Israelis. Not only does everyone know someone affected, but the sheer horror of it, and the suddenness of it seems to have been calculated toward maximal trauma. And I wonder what you see as the living out of traumatic experience these days in Israel and in Palestine for you, Hiba. What are you seeing in those around you in terms of their capacity to manage their feelings and think clearly? And um, one way of hearing the 35% figure is people are so stunned they don't know they can't imagine a way forward. They can't think clearly about a rational solution to this problem.
Yeah, I think the forward-looking thinking is not really there. So
Yeah,
it's still either present or past.
yeah,
And there is a cliche that Israelis are still living October 7th, but I think that's in many ways true, because we are on a Friday now. In a couple of hours, the weekend news will be broadcast on TV. Every week, you hear more testimonies from October 7, more investigations, more people speaking, more witnesses, more stories from hostages that have been brought back home. So it's still ongoing. We are still hearing what actually happened that same day. So the
Yeah.
trauma is still building up because with every week, with every new interview of a survivor, with every new evidence of a horror issue, with every debate at the UN about sexual violence, all that kind of magnifies and intensifies the trauma at the time when people still care for the personal safety of themselves and their loved ones. So I think we are still within that. Interesting to see how the Israeli society pitched in terms of voluntarism. People wanted to do something. So there were those who went to the military and did the service, but almost everyone, around my circles in October, in November, in December was doing something that was so different than what they do professionally. They were going to cook dinners for soldiers. They were going to peel apples. They were going to teach children at the hotel of people who were evacuated from the north. So it kind of changed the daily routine for many people, and people wanted to feel that they are doing something to support those in need. But in
Yes.
terms of looking into the future, almost doesn't happen, only within very
Yeah.
small circles. And when those that do look into the future, it's not clear to them what they see. There are so many different threats still here. We didn't speak about Lebanon and Israel and Hezbollah, and the real chance that later in the spring we will see more escalation there that will have grave consequences for Israel, for Lebanon. So the sense is it's still not over, and we don't know whether the damage that we already suffered will continue or we are already in processing stage of it.
Yes. Hiba, what do you think about what are you seeing in terms of the level of traumatic experience in those you associate with and hear from?
Well, I think for the Palestinians, I mean, of course, there are different types of traumas and different levels. And the initial, the force of the Israeli response and the numbers that have been killed and wounded. I mean, we're talking about 100,000 between dead and wounded, and not to mention the displacement of people, not to mention the starvation that's going on now, and the famine, and I mean, we cannot access Gaza, so we don't know what is happening to the children and to the women other than what we see from reports on television here and there. I mean, communication is very limited and we don't speak very much to a lot of people there, but I think the general sense is also of horror and misery and pain and trauma and the worry that what's going to happen with the next generation, the memories. I mean, these kids have seen so much death around them, and they are still living it. As Nimrod said, we're still living it. They're still in that condition of war. It's very difficult to assess the long-term impact on them as
Yeah.
a group, and but the general sense among all Palestinians is that collectively we feel for the Gaza population and the Gaza children and women, and when also when it also happened in October 7th, recognizing the sheer horror of the attack, of course, the reaction by Israel brought up the feelings of the Nakba for the Palestinians, because Israel started talking about forced displacement of the Gazans into Sinai, and there's still the fear of that and the worry about that. So I think it's a
Hmm.
different. People are feeling and experiencing different sets of traumas and wounds, and the memories are going to be very difficult to wipe
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The post war situation will also be a hugely post-traumatic situation that will need to be dealt with somehow. We're getting pretty far along in our conversation. Let me just ask you one more question, which is your thoughts about the future, the ways of moving forward that you would think about, and one particular part of that. One of the things we read over here so much is that one vision for the future involves a kind of new level of committed, capable leadership in the West Bank. And I wonder what you think about that and the emergence of a possible partner in a kind of, I don't know what, rejuvenated Palestinian authority that is committed to working with Israel to solve the problems. What do you think? What do you see in terms of a way forward?
Shall I take that up, Nimrod, first? First of all, yesterday, President Abbas appointed a new prime minister. Mr. Muhammad Mustafa, or Dr. Muhammad Mustafa, is now the new prime minister. And he has been tasked to form a new government with a new mandate as part of the reform that the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah will be undertaking. I think that is a good step, a positive step in the right direction, but certainly would have to be coupled with a lot of other actions. We need to ensure that the Palestinian Authority has the capacity to enter Gaza and take over the humanitarian crisis relief with international community, with international support, and to rehabilitate the population there, and of course the reconstruction plan. The Palestinian Authority also has to make sure that it is able to engage in constructive discussion with Israel when Israel is ready for that. Because, again, Prime Minister Netanyahu declares that he doesn't want to have a two-state solution and doesn't want to talk to the Palestinian Authority and doesn't want to have the Palestinian Authority in the Gaza Strip. And a resumption of its power there. So I think the dynamic also vis-a-vis Israel will hinge on again who will be next in Israel, supported by the regional and international interlocutors and stakeholders. Without that, the Palestinian Authority will not be able to fully reform, nor be able to engage in any meaningful way in Gaza and in the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip. Now, what role would Hamas play into all of this? It's still unclear. Are we going to form a national government or a technocratic government? This is going to be unfolding in the coming weeks. But according to the tasking orders of the new prime minister, the prime minister is to have at least half the ministers from the Gaza Strip. So those will be technocratic people, obviously. So the direction now is becoming clearer in terms of having a technocrat government rather than a national government. So again, building the capacity of the Palestinian security forces, building the capacity of the Palestinian authorities, ability to govern Gaza as well, and then slowly to pave the way to hold national elections is going to be very important, because also the desire and then the mood in the West Bank is to also change, of course, to elect a new president and to change the leadership top down.
Hmm. Hmm. Yes. Nimrod, what do you see?
I think that if you want to get to the two-state solution, first we need to acknowledge that it's a process, and we need to think of the sequencing and the roles of different actors within it. We spoke quite a bit about the need for political change, and that's definitely a must, looking at it from an Israeli perspective. So that's a domestic aspect. In terms of international activism, and you mentioned, Jerry, in some of your remarks about what's happening in the States and how the international community is looking more on the Palestinian issue than it did over the last years when it kind of sidelined the issue and looked at other burning topics. But the international community should spell out a clear diplomatic horizon showing its commitment to the two-state solution. It should try and consolidate a new international mechanism that will try to advance peace instead of the current mechanism, which is the Middle East Quartet, which is not really functioning for already several years. So all these groupings that we see now in terms of diplomatic efforts to reach ceasefires and deals on hostages, those should be consolidated into a new multilateral mechanism that will support peacemaking efforts. And one of the things that these mechanisms could do, in terms of the forward-looking thinking that you mentioned that is very much needed and necessary, is spell out the scenarios for support packages or incentive packages for peace. That's something that was beginning to be done before October 7th, especially by the EU and the Saudis and the Arab League, what was called the Peace Day effort, that was intended into developing an international incentive package, something, by the way, that Hiba, you remember we did some 6 or 7 years
Yes.
ago. Israelis and Palestinian expert that came to the international community saying, this is our needs. If you try to develop incentives, make sure to put on the table those incentives that fit the real needs on the ground. And we developed this proposal. And now I think this thinking comes into the more mainstream. So that's the international component. And then in terms of the Israel-Arab regional component, you need to link the normalization processes in a better way into the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Both the existing relationship, both the future ones, that is a must. And finally, in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian relationship, beyond the political level and the security and the economy, I think a special focus should be put on civil society. It takes us back to the beginning of our conversation, the importance of the people-to-people and the engagement between average Israelis and Palestinians that were very important in the 90s and even after the Second Intifada, have nearly disappeared even before October 7th. There were so few initiatives and organizations that carried through cross-border activities between Israelis and Palestinians. The disconnect between the societies has been immersed. Now it's even bigger than that. And after the dust settles, the war ends, I think one of the priorities, also for the funders community and the international community, is to step this up, to dismantle obstacles like anti-normalization tendencies in the Palestinian street, and fear and lack of trust in the Israeli street, and donor fatigue in the international community, and all kind of barriers of where you can meet, but make sure that Israelis and Palestinians, initially the ones that are already convinced in the need for peace, have them meet, have them talk, have them understand what happened, what could happen, what they want to do together. That I think is a very important thing that we don't see now.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful place for us to end because it's both hopeful, but it also is something that perhaps the International Dialogue Initiative and some of its members can try to contribute to in a very direct way. One of our colleagues, Robbie Friedman, does this kind of dialogue over and over again in Israel and between Israelis and Arab Israelis. So perhaps there's some opening for some further work from our part, further contribution from our part as well. Let me thank both of you, Hiba and Nimrod, for this really, really informative conversation. I really appreciate it. The IDI really appreciates it, and I bet our listeners will as well. So thank you both very, very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Nimrod. Bye-bye.
Thank you.